I think what we are talking about right now, though, is that we are seeing somewhat of a fraying of that sort of globalist system, and some of the reshoring initiatives, certainly, and specifically in the CHIPS Act, in that critical industry, are taking steps in the right direction to kind of correct some of those problems.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of On the Margin. Today, I am joined by Michel Kao, aka Urban Cowboy on Twitter. Michael is an ex-hedge fund manager and now runs his own private family office, but I'm sure many of you will probably be familiar with him already. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to finally meet you.
Yeah, you as well. Folks, we almost actually ended up doing this with another mic, and that would have been 3 mics on one show. Michael told me that 3 mics is actually okay. 4 is when you risk a hole in the space-time continuum. So
that's right.
It's a fundamental rule to the universe. Guys, I'm very excited for this show. On the Margin listeners, you guys probably know we've been really digging into kind of the dollar, energy, and the intersection there for a long time. We're really lucky to be joined by Michael today because he's actually premiering a thesis that's going to be debuting at a talk that he's giving in West Point in the next month or so. So, Michael, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your thesis. I'm just going to turn it over to you. I've got a whole bunch of questions for you. Can you just walk us through what's the title of your thesis? Why now? Like, why does the subject interest you?
Hey, yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to kind of to debut this thesis. Sometime maybe like 9 months ago, Lieutenant Commander Mike St. Pierre, who is my collaborator on this paper, reached out to me and told me about this symposium at West Point in February that he wanted to present at, and would I like to be his collaborator on it. And when he talked about that, the topic would be essentially the geopolitics of the dollar and how it relates to energy security and whatnot. I thought, well, that's totally in my wheelhouse, because that's what I naturally like to tweet about and think about and analyze. So we don't have the final title nailed down yet, but I guess a prospective title for this paper is going to be the primacy of the U.S. dollar and its role in the great power competition. And obviously, the great power competition that I referred to is none other than the one between the U.S. and China. So, at its very high level, the idea here is that the U.S.-led economic rules-based order, or RBO, as the military types like to use, is being challenged, obviously, by China, and that we need to recognize that the foundational pillar of this rules-based order is an economic pillar that rests on the primacy of the U.S. dollar. The primacy of the U.S. dollar in terms of its role as a global reserve currency rests upon certain elements of national power, which we will discuss, and we talk about the current threats and some of the inconsistent policies that are in a way at odds with our geostrategic initiatives. So we kind of conclude the paper with some very specific policy proposals on where we're strong, but where we are kind of fucking up, and we need to make some course corrections to ensure that this U.S.-led RBO continues.
You, in another podcast, I actually really like the way you laid things out between like exogenous forces and endogenous forces that support the US dollar, right? Exogenous forces kind of being the market structure, right, that supports the USD global system, and then endogenous forces, which is kind of this natural organic desire to use dollars, right? Maybe based on the assets of the US. So can you kind of describe a little bit, like tease apart what is that kind of reflexive relationship and how much of it comes from endogenous versus exogenous forces?
Yeah, so I'm gonna credit that use of endogenous and exogenous to our mutual friend Dimitri Kofinas, because
great question.
So I think in a Twitter space that he hosted that I participated in, he used that term, and I kind of latched onto it because I think that's exactly the way I think about it. I'm going to introduce maybe a a matrix to think about. Okay, so just it's a very simple 2x2 matrix. Think of it as strengths on the vertical axis. Sorry, currency exchange strength on the vertical axis, and adoption, okay, on the horizontal axis, right?
Mm.
So when you think of it this way, right, it kind of frames the endogenous exogenous argument, because the role of the U.S. dollar as a hegemonic global reserve currency is kind of captured in the adoption, that horizontal axis. And that adoption, the reason why the world has chosen the U.S. dollar as the primary reserve currency, and essentially, 90% of currency, all foreign exchange transactions are denominated in U.S. dollars. That rests more upon like these endogenous factors that would include, for instance, in our paper, we examine three key economic pillars. We talk about the importance of geography, right? Geographic assets that essentially allow the U.S. to spend its national treasure on things that other things other than defending, for instance, our physical borders, because we have almost impregnable physical borders compared to, say, China, right? Another economic pillar would be the natural resources that we have in terms of not just oil but food, right? And so when you compare that to China, they're naturally short these critical components. But then, the issue of industrial policy, right, or industrial capacity is what we were talking about, is an area where I think we've ceded quite a bit of leadership. Specifically, one of the themes in our paper, one of the key comparisons that we draw in our paper is comparing what's happened in the semiconductor industry versus the oil and gas industry. In the semiconductor industry, but both industries are industries that basically had their origins in the U.S. The U.S. invented both industries, if you think about it, right? From the first oil well drilled in Pennsylvania in the 1800s to the first semiconductors invented in the 1950s, the U.S. initially had dominance and then ceded leadership. Now, one of the themes that we are talking about is that, in the semiconductor industry, at least, it seems that the powers that be, our policymakers in multiple administrations, have finally come to terms with how critical that particular industry is, and have actually taken pretty solid legislative steps to address some of those shortcomings in conjunction with coercive measures like sanctions and export controls. But what I find ironic, and this is the part that pertains to energy, in the energy industry, oil and gas specifically, because of this blind devotion to the ESG mandate, we are essentially hamstringing ourselves in a critical industry where we have an innate advantage. We are actually the largest oil producer in the world right now, ahead of Saudi Arabia and Russia, and yet our own industrial policies are overtly hostile to that industry. So anyways, I'm digressing a little bit, maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I'm basically talking about these economic pillars of national power: geography, natural resources, industrial capacity, being key to the endogenous strength and the reason for the adoption of the dollar, right? The exogenous forces that determine more sort of like the cyclical currency exchange rates have to do with things like where we are in the monetary cycle, and interest rate differentials and whatnot. So when I think of that matrix that I described, right? So again, horizontal axis, being adoption, and vertical axis being currency exchange strength, I think of four different quadrants. Quadrant one being, okay, you have a situation where you've got a currency with weak adoption and weak exchange rates. That quadrant describes the challenges of many EM currencies, right? And at an extreme, it describes the challenge of the Weimar Republic, where a complete loss of faith and loss of adoption led to a hyperinflation and a hyper devaluation of the currency, right? That's quadrant one. Quadrant two, where you have relatively strong adoption but relatively weak exchange rates, can describe the quandary of, say, the euro and the yen in recent history, right? Where, the euro and the yen are the two largest components of the dollar index in terms of, the other key currencies that are in use in the world. They don't come close to the dollar in terms of dominance, but yet they are the two biggest other currencies in terms of adoption. And yet, because of differences in central bank policies, their currencies have undergone pretty severe devaluations recently against the U.S. dollar. And of course, in more recent history, right, and as in the last several months, you've seen the dollar itself take a breather and some of those currencies come back. That's quadrant two, right? Quadrant three would be currencies that don't have a lot of global adoption, but have always maintained a decent amount of currency exchange rate strength. And I would say a currency like Swiss franc falls into that category, right? Where it's not that widely used as a global currency, but it's always been perceived as a safe haven type of currency, right? And finally, we come to quadrant four. Quadrant four is where you've got a hegemonic currency in terms of adoption, and that also coincides with currency exchange rate strength, which is what we are experiencing right now in the U.S. dollar. And that combination results in what I call the U.S. dollar wrecking ball, right? Because when the entire world is essentially denominated in U.S. dollars, and the U.S. dollars are currently very, very strong, it results in the U.S. dollar wrecking ball. And so the final part of our thesis is a geopolitical one. So when I think about that from a sort of economic warfare perspective, well, I think it's interesting right now that the US dollar finds itself in quadrant four, because in the name of fighting inflation, there is an opportunity to sow economic chaos via a strong US dollar, via a US dollar wrecking ball, because I perceive the other regional economic blocs, namely the Eurozone, China, Japan, as ill-equipped to keep pace with the Fed. In fact, yesterday I posted a mini thread about this. I think that I said that, who's the mini thread was, who's really going to out-hawk the Fed? For me to ultimately call the cyclical top in the US dollar in this cycle, I have to really believe that either other central banks around the world are going to actually out-hawk the Fed, or the Fed is going to somehow outdove the rest of the world. Because remember, currency exchange strength is a relative thing, right? So the Fed could very well be on its way to hitting or getting close to that terminal Fed funds rate. But if the Fed stops hiking, do you really think that Lagarde is going to keep hiking? Do you really think that the Bank of Japan is going to relax yield curve control? Like I guess my view, I mean, look, I could be totally wrong on this. Maybe they are going to find their result. But when I look through the words and the jawboning and look through to actual policy actions, I get the sense that the rest of the world's central banks are all holding their collective breaths, hoping that the Fed can engineer a deep enough global recession so that they don't need to administer their hard medicine. Because, right? Because, we can talk further about that, but I see the Bank of Japan's yield curve control strategy, the recent relaxation of their 25 basis point upper bound on JGB yields to 50 basis points as like the reason for a secular resurgence of the yen. I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it. And then similarly in the Eurozone, I see this is a pretty out of consensus argument. I actually think that Mother Nature had to do with the ability for the Eurozone to weather this current winter as well as it has, because the consensus, remember, originally before around this Russia-Ukraine invasion, was that Europe could find itself in a real bind come winter, being cut off from Russian gas. Again, this goes right back to how energy policies are wrapped into the geopolitics of currencies, right? Because through all of these these blind initiatives to ESG, Germany in particular has made itself inextricably dependent on Russian gas flows. Were it not for Mother Nature's kindness this winter, I think Christine Lagarde, in turn, would not be able to be as sort of aggressive in her hawkish jawboning, right?
Michael, there's a lot to dig in on there. Let me just see if I can sum up. There's a lot of different, but you covered so much, and I just want to, especially, let me just try to sum up the endogenous exogenous argument here. Like, sure. Endogenous, I feel like I understand pretty intuitively. I actually almost think about it the two sides of a ledger, right? There's like the assets and the liabilities. On the assets that the U.S. has, you were sort of quoting some, like, there are a lot of geographical advantages. I know you're a fan of Peter Zeihan's U.S. is the accidental superpower. You were talking about arable land. I know the U.S. is 15 times the amount of arable land, compared to China. We've got strong waterways. All these were isolated and away from, Europe and China. And they all sit very close together. So there are like those sorts of advantages. I would also add deep and liquid capital markets and rock strong property rights laws and a solid legislative system. I would say those like the asset column. And then in the liabilities column, we kind of have our dollars, right, that we export to the rest of the world. But in a lot of ways, we'll get that it's an asset for us as well. Two questions that I have on the exogenous side of things. When I also think about some of the other reason why we have the USD as the reserve currency, it's all those assets we were talking about. Also, we have the strongest military, and we like it, right? We enforce other countries using the United States dollar as a form of trade. And then the other thing is we have a relationship especially with Saudi Arabia, but we basically made oil trade mandated that's denominated in USD and kind of created this idea of the petrodollar. So where would you put those two forces? Are those exogenous forces? And how significant do you think they are?
Let me just clarify something right off the bat, which is that the whole notion of Bretton Woods and then the subsequent, setting up the petrodollar system, I feel like sometimes that narrative is mischaracterized, because the narrative that I hear a lot is that, okay, well, Bretton Woods in 1944, basically the powers that be, set up this system, which was kind of like a Trojan horse. It basically got the world addicted to trade in U.S. dollars because, hey, it's going to be backed by gold. But then, wait a second, 1971, the Nixon shock, Nixon abandons convertibility to gold, and all of a sudden, but the rest of the world already has no choice. They're already hooked on the dollar system. So I know that I'm oversimplifying the narrative, but that's kind of where I hear a lot of the U.S. dollar naysayers going with that. But I think you have to study history a little bit and go back to the origins of the Eurodollar system, right? Eurodollar system, for those of your audience who might not know, is basically the rise of the use of U.S. dollars in Europe and then now the rest of the world, right? That are not governed by U.S. banking laws, but that are also not at the time governed by the backing of gold. Right? That happened. That happened starting in the 1950s, long before Nixon abandoned the gold convertibility issue. And why did that happen? Well, up until that point, up until basically the mid 40s and 50s, the pound sterling was the global reserve currency of the world. But a number of things happened in the 1950s that essentially made the U.S. dollar look like a better alternative. And so the culminating thing was that, well, there was Britain was facing a domestic inflation problem, and part of their cure to the inflation problem was instituting capital controls on sterling. And so even though the capital controls were in place for something like 16 months, the damage had been done, because when they did that, there was basically a flight to U.S. dollars. People wanted to invoice and transact in another liquid currency, and people started transacting in euro dollars, which meant that there was trade in dollars starting to happen that was well beyond the gold-backed dollars. You see what I mean? So when you look at that and you say, well, wait a second, it's interesting, because if that happened, then if the endogenous strength of the dollar at the time wasn't truly gold. In fact, when Nixon abandoned gold convertibility, you could even say that he kind of freed the world from being anchored to the dollar, and basically allowed widespread adoption of the U.S. dollar as a fiat currency, right? And so it's interesting, because I'm reading a book right now by Perry Maryland called Money and Empire, and he's talking about the rise of the dollar system as viewed through the personal lens of Charles Kindleberger, right, who was instrumental in basically shaping that system. And there is a great quote that I wanted to read. So, the narrative that the balance of payments deficit is the death knell for the U.S. dollar. I find it interesting that Charles Kindleberger decades ago said that, quote, the U.S. was not so much running a balance of payments deficit, rather merely supplying the world's demand for dollars as a liquid reserve. And so, all right, so coming back to your question, right, the reason why I think the military advantage and then the petrodollar system arise from these endogenous factors is because, okay, let's talk about the military advantage for a second. The geography ultimately, I think, informs our military advantage, because when you think about the U.S. and our 800 bases around the world, what's enabled us to focus our defense spending and military spending on being able to project power far and wide? Because we have an impregnable geography in terms of our homeland. We've got oceanic buffers where the enemy would have to cross 3,000 to 5,000 miles of ocean, right, on the east and west, and then we've got friendlies to the north and south, and then of course you talked about the arable land, you talked about the river, the waterways, etc. Right, so that innate geographic advantage, which, by the way, China lacks those advantages and has to spend serious national treasure on One Belt, One Road to recreate what we have innately, right? So it's a much bigger uphill battle for China to recreate those advantages and try to have the ability to have force projection, right? And they just don't have that. I mean, much ado talk is made about their navy, for instance, right? That has more ships now than the U.S., et cetera, and how the U.S. has let its navy go into disrepair. But look, The U.S. Navy has about 275 ships, totaling about 4.6 million tons. The Chinese Navy has about, 380 ships, but it totals about 1.8 million tons. So that tells you that they have a huge flotilla of small boats that maybe give them green water superiority within the first island chain, but they can't force project outside of the first island chain. Our Navy is a blue water Navy, and that was only enabled by the fact that we don't need to patrol our green waters, our coastal waters, in the same way they do, right? So that hopefully that answers your question on the military and why that ultimately is an endogenous factor.
Yeah.
And then similarly, I would say that the petrodollar system is. I wanted to recall that history of the rise of the eurodollar banking system, because that's kind of the reason for the petrodollar system too. Yes, it was originally set up, as a top-down construct, but I kind of want to sort of shed some light on the fact that, look, every day the dollar has to earn its exorbitant privilege, because if it were not the most liquid currency, with the strongest military, with the most liquid bond markets, with the most trusted rule of law, the and all of these other endogenous factors, were it not for all of those factors, the market would organically vote it out, right? And you're seeing, but I want to caution that, okay, it's there are chinks in the armor, right? The chinks in the armor are that, and we go into this in our paper, that there in recent years, especially, I would say like the last, call it 15 years, the U.S. has gone kind of sanctions crazy, right? Especially in the area of financial sanctions. And I read a great book by Agatha Damare. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name. It's called Backfire, and it talks about the different forms of financial and economic coercion. And financial sanctions, especially when it comes to some of the more extraterritorial secondary sanctions that embroil our allies, have led to, even, for instance, the Eurozone, to try to figure out ways to skirt, say, Iranian sanctions, right? So these are things that, a lot of the U.S. dollar naysayers will say, will point to, the weaponization of the U.S. dollar as a sort of abuse of that exorbitant privilege, and why this will lead to the unwinding of the U.S. Hegemonic system. I wouldn't go so far as to say that, because when you're focused on, for instance, like DeFi and crypto, right? Network effects have a lot to do with whether or not an ecosystem is going to survive as the winner take all. There's nothing that even remotely compares to the inherent network effects of the existing system that's in place. But that's not to say that we as a country are pursuing certain policies that are encouraging competition, right? China, as we all know, is kind of leading the charge, right? China is leading the charge on trying to figure out ways how to supplant the dollar. A lot has been made of, for instance, President Xi's recent visit to Saudi Arabia, and trying to get Saudi Arabia to conduct its trade in Chinese renminbi, right? But number one, nothing's been inked. Number two, the total amount of oil that Saudi Arabia supplies to China is 1.6 million barrels per day. That's roughly 1.6% of total global trade. So let's say that Saudi Arabia actually does that and conducts its entire trade in Chinese yuan, it would be a shot across the bow for sure, right? But it's just that by in and of itself is just not a significant factor. But I think here are the reasons why Saudi Arabia wouldn't do it, right? Despite Mohammed bin Salman's distaste for the current administration, right? I don't think he would want to risk putting all of their country's oil revenues to China in non-convertible currency, whose um, uh, you know underlying government just doesn't have the same rule of law characteristics as the U.S. It's not a coincidence that the Saudi rial itself is a hard dollar peg. It's also not a coincidence that the Chinese yuan is a soft dollar peg.
Mm.
So I think of it like this. This is an analogy I like to use, right? So um, they very well might conduct part of their trade in Chinese renminbi to help out Xi and to allow Xi to basically not have to have some of be able to use some renminbi in the oil trade. But think of it like this. From Saudi's perspective, right? I'm going to use an Amazon comparison. If you buy something on Amazon and you need to return it, and you need to select whether or not you want your refund in terms of Amazon credit or get your money back, well, look, if it's $50, if it's $100, you're going to be fine with like Amazon credit because you know that you're going to use it, right? But what if it's $5,000? You're going to want your fucking money back. Well, that's the way, right? So that's the way I think of like from Saudi's perspective. Okay, so if it's like a small amount and to keep one of my biggest customers happy, to give them a political win on the world stage, oh yeah, I basically got this deal from Saudi Arabia, sure. But if I'm going to put my national treasure, am I gonna risk it all in a currency that's non-convertible, that's experiencing a huge property crisis, and a country that has total opacity even in its amount of total debt load? There's no way. I'm not seeing that.
So let me ask you a question here. So we're talking about currency and geopolitics walk hand in hand, right? So let's say I'm with you. I agree with you basically on all the points that you're making about the endogenous reasons for why the USD sits at the center of this global reserve currency system, right? People want dollars. Let's say there's like two ways that I could think about that would benefit the United States, right? One, you could say, look, all of these things that we made us the reserve currency in the first place, we want to reinvest in, right? So obviously we can't reinvest in more arable land, et cetera. But what we can do is like use, the demand for dollars and the ability to issue US debt globally as a way to continue to fund, like invest in our national infrastructure, in our industry, strengthen our property laws, reinvest in the side of the assets that people want. Then there's kind of this other bucket where we say, this dependency that the rest of the world has on dollars, that's an important geopolitical tool, right? And that's what I would kind of more broadly lump in sort of the sanctions bucket, right? So when people are either acting not in the best interest of the United States or doing things that we don't like, we sort of use it as a punishment. How would you weigh how the U.S. should kind of move between those two benefits?
Well, reading Agatha's book, Backfire, really got me thinking on, okay, there's sanctions are useful, but rarely achieve their end goals, right? If you define the end goals as real regime change. And the problem is that most of these sanctions have been levied against autocratic powers where there is a lack of transmission mechanism between the discomfort that the sanctions might inflict on the population and how that population what that population might do to the regime. Because under an autocratic, iron-fisted regime, there's nothing that the population can do. All the financial sanctions will do in the end is that they harden the local population's hatred of the U.S., but and the underlying government is still every bit in as the underlying government is still in control. So when you talk about like history of sort of failed sanctions from a inability to actually cause regime change, you can look at Cuba, you can look at Iran, you can look at North Korea. The list goes on and on and on. Where economic coercion has actually been more effective is when they have gone hand in hand with certain export controls and certain industrial policies. I view sanctions. So to kind of extend this into my own thinking, I kind of view financial sanctions as almost purely reactive and coercive policies, but there are other tools out there, right? And two of the tools that we talk about in our paper are more proactive policies, like industrial policies, and in particular, we can talk about how in the oil and gas industry, for instance. Policymakers can really learn from the semiconductor industry and apply some of those lessons and the things that they've done right in the oil and gas industry. So, for instance, the semiconductor industry, right? The policymakers, with this CHIPS Act and also with key export controls and sanctions, have actually. I actually think that what the Biden administration has done, and also what the Trump administration started with some of the sanctions against Huawei and all these things, I think these sanctions were actually effective in basically cutting off certain critical path components and supplies in the semiconductor industry to China. But at the same time, I applaud the CHIPS Act because it is a recognition, albeit a late recognition, that the seeding of our dominance in that industry is primarily in the fabrication space, right? We have ceded a lot of our fabrication capabilities to Taiwan. Now, look, Taiwan is not China, but Taiwan Semiconductor, being the world's essentially foundry, is of key geopolitical importance. Taiwan is not China, but that's the reason why China covets Taiwan. One of the key reasons why China covets Taiwan, I think, right? So when you look at how Taiwan and now how China is subsidizing their semiconductor industries, our CHIPS Act is still paltry in terms of the tax subsidies. I think that the headline number is something like $52 billion, but China's subsidy to Huawei alone is something like $75 billion. They have this. There's this other company there, which is it's a private company, but it's really a front for state-run subsidies called Tsinghua Unipolar or something. I can't remember the exact name, but there's a great book that Chris Miller recently wrote called Chip War that talks about how this private company is basically a front for another 22 billion of state-led subsidies for the semiconductor industry, right? And he talks about, Chris Miller, the author, talks about how she has basically said, okay, he's using very martial terms and saying, you know what, let's call forth the assault. China wants to have the capabilities of TSMC and is willing to make the investments. So look, our policymakers are recognizing that and are taking some steps comparatively tentative steps, but at least are going in the right direction. When I look at oil and gas, I'm kind of incredulous at how opposite it is, right? So just a couple of stats real quick, right? So I think a couple of high level stats are very important to compare and contrast, because when you talk about the world of semiconductors, for instance, you are talking about here are some critical choke points and dependencies, right? So Taiwan supplies 37% of global chips, 41% of semiconductors, 90% of all advanced chips, right? China's currently only at 15%, and U.S. currently only at 12%, right? Now, according to Chris Miller in Chip War, if you look at the overall semiconductor supply chain, including design, including semiconductor equipment, everything, then China's number, I believe Taiwan's number falls all the way down to something like 6%, and the U.S., believe it or not, is at 39%. And when you look at the entire supply chain, because the U.S. and the semiconductor industry still controls critical choke points. Like, for instance, it has about 50% share in semiconductor equipment. It's got 75% share in semiconductor design software. So the U.S. still has critical choke points and some of these export controls that I talked about earlier are targeting these specific choke points that China is totally dependent on, right? And but even so, we are taking appropriate proactive steps to shore up our weaknesses there, and to kind of target China's vulnerabilities. Now let's talk about oil now.
Can I just give one plug, actually? The founding story of TSMC is amazing. It's this guy Morris Chang founded it.
Yes,
it's a super cool story.
So
there's a great podcast called Acquired, which does a 3-hour deep dive on TSMC. If anyone's just a nerd about it and interested, I highly recommend that podcast.
I would like to listen to that.
It is worth listening to. It's a great show.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So look, in OPEC's case, and now let's throw some stats at this, right? So in OPEC's case, you've got OPEC supplying about 40% of global oil. China, of course, supplies nothing, right? They consume everything that they produce and then some, right? They're a huge net importer. But look, the U.S. is basically the largest single supplier at something like 12.5% of total barrel oil equivalents right now, right? So and Russia and Saudi each supply roughly 11%. So what I find amazing is that, this is something I wrote in the paper. I said, look, this blind focus on ESG and EVs is basically threatening to shift our 40% dependency on OPEC plus, but where we still command the leading role of world production at 12.5%, to an 85% dependency on China's rare earth refining capacity. So, in what universe is that a sensible risk-reward trade-off from a national security standpoint? So, and the policies that we're undertaking, so everything from canceling, for instance, Keystone, I'll tell you in a little bit why that's important, to essentially, the lack of subsidization of oil and gas is one thing, but the policies currently are overtly hostile, with the threats of windfall profits taxes, and even threats of export bans, right? Export bans, I've written at length on Twitter about how something like that would be very, very dangerous. The export ban narrative is that, hey, we've had this export ban in place from 1975 to 2015, and we were fine with it. So why not, essentially pursue a policy of autarky and basically, ban exports, and that way we're going to have cheap domestic gasoline prices. That's kind of the narrative, and it was even publicly floated by the current Department of Energy, right? But when But when you delve deeper into the weeds, you realize, wait a second. Now, the 1975 export ban was set up because at the time, there was a 1973 Arab oil embargo. At the time, U.S. conventional production was already on the wane. So when we set up an export ban for 40 years, it really didn't matter because we didn't have any oil to export. Okay. It didn't matter. It was all politics, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing, like you can't discount American ingenuity because the oil shale revolution kind of started around like 2009, 2010. And then by 2015, when the export ban got lifted, it was actually a recognition that, well, wait a second, our refiners have, because of the dependency of Middle Eastern crude, have been all tooled to process heavier blends of oil, right? But the oil that we are producing from shale is light sweet. And so we can't use all of the light sweet that we produce. So let's repeal the export ban, which is a smart thing, because by repealing the export ban, it allowed the U.S. shale to really open the spigots and export the excess of what we cannot, that our refiners still cannot fully consume. But get this, the amount of imports from the Middle East didn't materially change from before the repeal of the export ban and after the repeal of the export ban, because we need those heavy grades. So, and by the way, where else can we get some of those heavy grades? Canada. But what did we do? We canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, so if we actually banned exports, it would be a disaster, not just for the oil and gas sector here. It would be a disaster for the domestic consumer, because we would actually have to import oil and Brent, which would be just spiking, and then it would at the same time bankrupt our oil. So I just give these examples as that we have innate advantages here, far more, I would, in a way, far more than the innate advantages that we have, for instance, in semiconductors. And yet we're doing, taking the right steps in semiconductors, but we are completely taking the wrong steps when it comes to energy policy.
Going the wrong way.
Going the wrong way.
So let me see if I've summed up the point of your thesis basically so far. So USD is the very privileged place that the United States has in the global reserve currency system is inextricably linked, right, to hegemony for the United States. There's a certain reflexivity there, right? There's a very natural, organic, endogenous reason why the rest of the world uses the US dollar. It gives us certain privilege that's reflexive on the way up, but also, if we shoot ourselves in the foot, it could be bad on the way down.
We have to earn that privilege every day.
We have to earn it. Exactly.
Absolutely.
So we, in some places, that kind of intersects with industrial policy. In some places, we're doing all right. Maybe in the world of semiconductors, space of energy, especially oil, not so much. Now, one of the other wrenches in there is this relationship in between energy and inflation, and how that's throwing a further wrench, right, in everything that's going on. I know your idea of inflation, right? Everything kind of started being short energy, right? And that has kind of crept into all of these stickier components. I'm kind of just curious because we're recording this on the 12th and CPI just came out today. But I'd be curious, do you think CPI, like inflation, further complicates things? Is it a small, bucket of noise here and it really isn't going to impact the great power competition? Like what, if any, relationship does oil have in everything that we're talking about?
Well, so I think this is where I offer an interesting twist to a geopolitical use of the dollar. So I'm going to caveat this by saying that I personally have a big long-term bet in oil through a private equity that I don't trade or anything. It's a long-term bet, but the reason why I made that long-term bet, it was and I made it back in 2016, 2017 era during the depths of the oil bear market. But it was a contrary bet because even then I was recognizing that there's been a lack of long-term investment in the industry. And over the last 5 years, that's only been exacerbated, right? Total lack of investment and hostility towards the sector. So from a long-term perspective, that makes me very, very bullish. The commodity itself, right? But my advocacy of proactive industrial policy, you realize, is completely talking against my book, right? Because what I'm saying is that what the US needs to do is what it's currently not doing. It needs to invest not only in exploration and production, it needs to retool and expand its refining networks. In other words, the US to really have true sort of energy independence ought to be encouraging our industry to and subsidizing the oil and gas industry to continue being a leading producer, and then when it comes to specific objectives of defanging, say, the Russian economy, the best way to do it actually is to flood the world with oil. The best way to do it is to flood the world with oil. It's not so much that, okay, we're trying all these like sanctions and embargoes and whatnot, right? But Russian oil flow hasn't stopped.
Right.
It hasn't stopped. And the best way to deal a blow there is also through lower oil prices and flooding the world with oil. But I'm kind of talking against my long-term book, right? But the reason why I made that long-term bet is because I see the wheels of change. They grind very, very slowly, and the world has transfixed itself on this ESG narrative. The fundamental problem that I see with the ESG narrative is that it is ascribing, again, tying this back to chips now, it is ascribing Moore's law dynamics to the world of moving molecules. Energy transitions are not going to be like the internet transition, where moving bits can move at the speed of Moore's law. You cannot move molecules in the same way, and so by starving investment, long-term investment in hydrocarbons, and basically trying to push the world to prematurely into a transition to EVs, we're going to be, and I think in the next, sometime within this decade, I think, into a very, very precarious position where there might be more demand, even in a sort of tepid global economy, could exceed total spare capacity, right? That's right. So that's not to say that and there's this whole complicated reflexive relationship too now, because it's my view that oil was what kickstarted this entire bout of inflation that we're experiencing, and it then sort of bled into other areas, other stickier core components of inflation. And so it's kind of ironic that I actually wrote a piece along with Alex Dahl, who I know from Twitter, who we since the summer, essentially both of us have been actually bearish on oil prices, but from a cyclical standpoint. And I'm not going to speak for Alex, but speaking for myself, I'm long-term bullish, but in the short term, I'm bearish because of this negative feedback loop that the Fed and world central bankers are now all on the warpath to try to fight and stymie this inflation, which goes back to what I was alluding to earlier about potentially the strong dollar as a potential geopolitical weapon. What I'm saying here is that in the name of fighting inflation, right, a strong U.S. dollar can also accomplish certain geopolitical objectives,
Mm,
because we are at a point in time where the transmission mechanisms for tight monetary policy are uneven throughout the world. The rest of the world's economies are not as well equipped as the US economy at this point in time to continue to hike. So when you talk about the eurozone, yet in yesterday's thread, I talked about how I named I listed a couple of different factors, right? So, for instance, I talked about how the eurozone has been kind of given a pass because of Mother Nature and benign weather prices, but we all know about their energy dependence, right? Another thing is when you look at household debt to income ratios. I posted this really interesting chart that showed that the U.S. From this perspective is the lowest, at least amongst like the G7, right? When you look at another chart that I think is really interesting is when you look at the percentage of variable rate mortgages, the U.S. again is the lowest in the world because we have encouraged home ownership through having longer term mortgages. But when you look at, for instance, Japan, Australia, Canada, all these countries that have very, very high percentages of floating rate mortgages, these countries have natural limits to keeping monetary policy excessively tight because they absolutely crush their household sector, right? And then of
mm,
course, like the big elephant in the room here is China, right? So the fourth chart that I put in my thread yesterday was talking about how the central bank balance sheets are so bloated because when everybody criticizes the Fed and says that the Fed has been buying through its quantitative easing program, has been buying all these treasuries and whatnot. Well, the U.S. Fed's total central bank assets as a percentage of GDP is only 34%. You compare that to the BOE's 41%, the ECB's 60%, and then the BOJ is 120%. Right? So there are, and then what's conspicuously absent in that G4 comparison is China, because China situation, I've been finding it very difficult to find a true apples to apples comparison because there are all these like obfuscating dynamics between China's state banks and the PBOC. But Peter Zeihan has this very, very interesting chart in his latest book where he basically estimates Chinese private credit relative to the rest of the world, and it is just off the charts.
yeah.
So what I to tie it all together, I'm basically saying that in November I wrote another piece about I call the current dynamic the geopolitical mosh pit, because central banks are in this sort of every man for himself dynamic where there are different domestic incentives in each country, and because of all of these various sort of straitjacketing mechanisms that are that the other sort of competitors in the great power competition face relative to the U.S., we're at this point where a strong U.S. dollar doesn't necessarily hurt ourselves that much. It will feed back in some ways, right? Because a strong U.S. dollar, discourages exports. But we were never a big exporting nation to begin with. In fact, there's one more chart that I have in my paper that talks about how it shows how the U.S. In term exports as are the U.S. is far less dependent on exports than most other global economies, right? So a strong dollar policy also accomplishes this geopolitical objective of sowing chaos. Remember, I talked about how
Yeah.
sowing chaos is a lot cheaper than defending against it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for listening to On the Margin. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up about a conference that we have coming up in the new year called Permissionless. I'm sure most of you all been there last year. It is the cultural event of the year. We had over 5,500 people down in Palm Beach. This year, we are moving to Austin, Texas. You know what they say about Texas? Everything's bigger in Texas. So last year we had a really great lineup of speakers. We had the two co-founders of Robinhood, Vlad Tenev and Baiju Bot. We had Chris Dixon. We had some of the folks that have been on the show a whole bunch of times, Jim Bianco, Dan Tapiero. Just a phenomenal lineup of speakers, and you can expect the same this year. If you use Margin 10, you will get 10% off on a ticket. Again, that's Margin 10, because I love you guys so much. Click the link at the bottom of the show notes. Hope to see you there in person. I've got one question before I kind of want to end on big themes and big topics here that we've discussed. This dollar wrecking ball. So I totally understand the connection there about how it can be a geopolitical tool, right? So for let's maybe, if we don't want to say adversaries, our adversaries are unfriendlies like China, right? A strong U.S. dollar, especially one, the combination of the dollar plus the necessity to buy dollars or to buy oil in dollars, right? You swing that around. I'm sure China's very worried about importing commodity inflation, right? Like, not to mention the rest of just access to their trade and their reserves, all that kind of stuff. The problem is when you've got this really powerful wrecking ball swinging around the world, it's a little bit of a blunt tool, right? And it's already starting to hit into some of our allies, right? Over in the Eurozone, Japan.
And ourselves, right?
And
because
ourselves.
There is a negative feedback loop ultimately in using this tool.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that's my, I guess, observation. I have a question for you on, when it comes to industrial policy, there was you actually started to alluded to this when you were talking about the quote from Perry Merling, but have you ever heard of Dutch disease or resource curse, this concept?
Yes.
So basically the idea for the audience is, if in countries, it was originally called Dutch disease because at some point, like the 16 or 1700s, the Netherlands found this enormous, reserves of oil and gas, basically, and they started to, and it actually ended up being a net negative for the entire country, because like a very small class basically started to gather this up and export it, which meant that it strengthened the currency. It benefited a very small group of people, right? The exporters of that commodity, but then it strengthened the currency. The rest of the country wasn't able to do exports for that reason, and ended up being sort of a net negative, and that's why they called it resource curse. There was people have made that comparison, and it's kind of exactly what Perry Merling was saying, which was, as the issuer of the global reserve currency, we have an obligation to the rest of the world to provide an enormous amount of dollars. So I agree with that observation that the deficit that the United States produces on a yearly basis mostly has to do with that dynamic, right? The rest of the world needs dollars in order to get trade. The only way they can really accumulate dollars in a reliable way is to run a trade surplus, which means we have to run a deficit. So if you almost apply the analogy of resource curse, there's a small industry, which honestly largely has been kind of finance, right, which exports dollars. But then what that has resulted in is it's hurt the rest of our economy, our kind of core manufacturing parts of the US economy, honestly, like the middle class of America, our ability to export. And that part of the industrial base has been hollowed out, right? So that's a connection that that metaphor really hit with me a while ago.
Fascinating. That's really interesting.
I'd be curious,
really interesting.
Yeah, what your take is on that.
I have to think about that more. I think it's a really interesting analogy. I think that maybe it's not quite the same, because the dollar, the part of that argument that I find a little bit more tenuous is the fact that our resource is the exportation of dollars. You know what I mean? That's the part that's a little bit more tenuous. It's not quite the same as saying, okay, well, you know what? Saudi Arabia has oil and as a result of that natural endowment knows nothing, has no incentive to do anything else but to export oil. I don't quite see it exactly that way, but I can see some of the similarities. I would say that the hollowing out of the manufacturing base has a bit more to do with pretty bad industrial policies on our part, and I mean, part of it also goes to the idea that, we have at our core a capitalist market driven system, whereas some of the other big competitors in the great power competition, especially China, are state led economies, right? Where they can direct um, spending and subsidization in certain industries and keep them unfairly competitive, right? And so that I would say that has allowed the great hollowing out of the manufacturing base, because our companies in pursuit of profits naturally gravitate towards the cheapest costs of labor, and
Yeah.
in a global system, right, um, that's where it flows. But I think what we are talking about right now, though, is that we are seeing somewhat of a fraying of that sort of globalist system, and some of the reshoring initiatives, certainly, and specifically in the Chips Act, in that critical industry, are taking steps in the right direction to kind of correct some of those problems.
Yeah. I agree with you. It's a really fair point on industrial policy. And there's a great, I've referenced it so many times on the show. I'll again find it, link it in the show notes. But Sir James Goldsmith gave a great speech about China entering the World Trade Organization a while ago. And it was basically, he was advocating that that was not the right move, at least for developed nations. And it's pretty fascinating to go back and watch. I
Yeah,
think he's been pretty safely vindicated. And it's very
for sure.
interesting to hear it's sort of a debate live that I think happens on Charlie Rose. So you should hear the counter arguments as well. It's pretty
I mean,
funny.
I would say that was probably one of the biggest sort of foreign policy miscalculations of the last several decades that our
I
country has
agree.
made.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Last point on this, because it's on the idea that it's not doesn't always apply resource curse to money. There was a book that Niall Ferguson wrote called The Ascent of Money, which if you have it as a voracious reader, you'd probably find relatively interesting. It kind of traces the history of like money and currency as a precious metal, and then he goes into debt in the Italian kind of banking age, right, like Florence, and then he goes into equity, and he ends with this
get it.
chapter. You'd actually probably really like it, on what he calls chimerica, and this relationship in between
Yeah,
China and America, that reflexive relationship there. But he actually begins with an analogy about resource curse from when Portugal goes over to, and they find this enormous silver mine in the Andes.
mm,
He actually
mm,
also uses that as an example for, it's bad for two reasons. Because one, it was actually so much money, it hampered innovation, and it encouraged sort of
yeah,
rent-seeking behavior. But also because they had so much silver, that money transitioned from a precious metal in the form of silver to credits and entries on a ledger, and they couldn't wrap their minds around that transformation because they had so much access to. So it's just an
interesting,
interesting, it's an
interesting.
interesting
All right,
idea to delve into.
all right,
Okay,
great
I've got another.
recommendation.
Thank you, thank you. It's one of my favorite. Jason gave it to me, so my co-founder Jason deserves the credit. Um, I have another question for you on this, and this is where I want to get into just your thoughts, like high level, on the power struggle, and almost your personal thoughts on how you'd like to see it play out or where you think we are. But here's where I totally agree. First of all, I'm in New York. I was born in Boston. I am an American. I'll be honest, like it's impossible for me to approach this without a little bit of bias. Like I know that there are problems with the United States, but I am very much in the camp, to use your phrase, it's the cleanest of the dirty shirts, right? Like I think it is a great country still. We're certainly not perfect, but honestly, when I like look out into the world at the alternatives, some of the great powers that are challenging us, I would not want a world that's controlled by China in its current state. Nothing against it. It's more the CCP really than anything else.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
One thing that I've thought about is the reason why I believe that is because we've set up our constitution and our culture and our setup. There are these like structural things that we believe in and implemented in the United States that sort of keep us honest, right? Like we believe that the United States can't come in and just take your property, right? We believe in, and it's enshrined there in the Constitution, and people are kind of nuts about the Constitution, but rightly so. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to the press, all of this stuff. So one thing that worries me a little bit with some of this talk about USD primacy is it tends to, the enforcing body of USD primacy in the government is really pushing pretty aggressively for lack of financial privacy. And these two arguments are getting swirled together, which is we need the United States dollar to be at the center of everything, but at the same time, we want to track and monitor all your movements. So this is where crypto kind of comes into a little bit, because I whether or not you're a supporter of it, I think what it's saying at the core is that like we don't want that surveilled, and there needs to be some kind of check on the power here, right? Because the whole history of the United States is going from small state-controlled thing to something that looks more like an empire, right? I understand this not in that form right now, but like that's my one like just thought or question to you would be: are there logical limits on the amount of power that we want to grant the United States, either through dollar primacy or whatever it is, so that we don't eventually become the threat that we're trying to face? Does that all make, that was sort of a rambling thought. Does that make sense or resonate
Yeah,
at all?
I think I get the big gist of the question, and I'll kind of I kind of have an oblique answer to it, which
Mm,
is that I think ultimately, going back to the endogenous pillars that we were
mm,
talking about, right, and geography specifically, I've actually thought that the fact that if there's any sort of Dutch disease, right? I actually would say that the Dutch disease has to do with the fact that we are so blessed from a
huh,
natural geographic advantage perspective that it's allowed us to have a lot of policy fuck ups. And right, and so in a
yeah,
way,
yeah,
in a way, if you think about it, I actually think that our system of government, our federalist system of market driven government, I think can only succeed because of those natural geographic advantages. Because I think that if you think about the rest of the world and its relative lack of those natural advantages, I think when you take a country like China, for instance, where they are literally naturally short a lot of these geographic advantages that we talked about, whether it's like waterways, arable land, it's coastlines, deep water capability, all this stuff, right? Um, it requires a very, very strong centrally led, state led mandate to try to hold it all together. It's
yeah,
like Han Solo's Millennium Falcon. It's a bucket of bolts. You gotta you gotta hold. You need a very strong top
yeah,
down structure to kind of hold the shit together, because right, because the natural state of the world is to go towards entropy, and
yeah,
and without all of these natural advantages, you need that autocratic system of controls. And so I think that's why, relating it to your question of like, cryptocurrencies and CBDCs and the digital yuan and things like that, I I I, I see what they're trying to do with it, right? I see the again, these are the U.S. dollar naysaying arguments about, oh, China's rolled out this pilot program to 300 million people, blah blah blah. They're so far ahead with CBDCs, blah blah blah. But to your point, will our um, sort of market driven federalist system allow will the population allow basically a digital dollar that basically supplants the existing banking system, where the U.S. government, the Fed, can know exactly where all of our purchases are going? I don't know that. I don't know that that would happen here. I would say that, if we do adopt a CBDC, it would probably be at a different layer where it doesn't. We would still have the existing banking system. Maybe the layer of extraction is at the stops with the banks, so that there is a buffer between the banking system and which who remain trusted intermediaries, uh, remain a buffer between us, the end consumer and citizen, and the government. You follow what I'm saying?
mm, I do, I do.
But the PBOC is trying to. It sounds like they're trying to circumvent that layer entirely.
Yeah,
And,
they are.
you know,
And that, you know, it's, I mean, even if you just look at how China handled COVID and lockdowns differently than the United States, right? And
exactly,
we caught a
precisely.
lot of we caught a lot of flack for that in the beginning, but
Yep.
frankly, like I'd far rather be in the United States right now than China. They're still locking down over there. Can you
100%.
imagine that?
I said this at the time. I
Insanity.
said there was so much like pushback and flack that the United States got for our ineffective COVID response, and I'm like, okay, the problem that I think people aren't really buying is that we have a federalist system. In a
Right.
federalist system, you're not going to be able to have an autocratic response unless you declare martial law and forbid travel across state lines.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Um,
The point though that I was trying to
for better and for worse, right?
for better and for worse, and
But generally better, I would say. Generally better.
generally better, I think. And you know, powers get ceded to governments in crises. You know, usually what ends up happening, right? The reason why I think there's actually an autocratic or centralizing force to governments over great periods of time is when times are good, the citizenry, it's very easy for citizenry to say, I don't want the government involved in thing X, Y, or Z. This is the classic political phrase, like never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Something happens, all of those things, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, rears its head again. People say, I want safety and security over everything else. I'll cede personal liberties. And then that governments like generally gather force over time. You can see that force in our financial system, by the way, like the history of like national banks, the first and second national bank in the United States, and now we
Oh,
have the Federal
I
Reserve.
listened to Jack's. That was a great episode that Jack
I've
Farley
listened to
did.
it like
Yeah,
3 times. I
that was
keep
great.
referring to it, but I thought it was
Yeah,
phenomenal. But
yeah.
even outside of central banking, you look at like savings and loans get rolled up to banks, and then banks, you know, there are, you know, hundreds of regional banks, and now there are like 6 bulge bracket banks that have all the assets in the US. So there's sort of a natural gravity towards centralization and consolidation that I get. I guess the one point I'm trying to make here is that what part of what makes the US great, I think, part of what I like about the United States is like a healthy mistrust of government. We do maintain some of those things, and I want to be careful not to cede too much ground, right? Saying, because I hear you, I'm with you. Like I understand that there's a power competition coming between the US and China. I just think we want to go in with clear eyes and say, like, let's not panic and give a bunch of power to the United States that they don't need to succeed in the power competition. That was the kind of point I was trying to land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I recognize. Look, I'm a free market kind of guy.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a free markets guy at the end of the end of the road, and I'm so therefore, like it seems kind of incongruent for me to say that, hey, you know what, we need some industrial policies like subsidization of certain industries, but yet the problem I see here is that it's um, in a way, you kind of have to adapt with the times and fight fire with fire, right?
Yeah.
Because what our adversaries are very adept at is recognizing that we have a federalist market-driven system, and there are things that are structurally more difficult for us to do, like having a cohesive industrial policy. I don't know if you. I mean, in that, I thought Chris Miller's Chip War book was great because it painted the history and the evolution of the semiconductor industry. There
Yeah.
was, and I think in the '90s, there was an attempt at having some sort of cohesive industrial policy through this group called Semitech, but it was a complete abject failure. It just didn't work. Semitech's goal was to try to have some sort of cooperation between the different players, but it didn't work. It's very hard to have that kind of centralization in our naturally market driven structure, right? Because we are our for better or for worse, in general, I would say for better, our economy is predicated against like the bare knuckled fight of competition. And
Yeah.
that's what's made us strong as a country. But what I really can't stand though is going, even if we didn't do any subsidization, at least not stand in the way with overt
Yeah.
hostility towards like critical industries, like what we're doing in oil and gas.
Yeah.
I call that anti-subsidization. We're actually hamstringing a key area of competitive strength unnecessarily.
I'm with you on that. I kind of feel the same way that you. I've tried to develop internally a cohesive framework or way of thinking about this, but it's very difficult to do because, like, even so, I told you before this, I was a classics major, so I love looking at Rome, and I'm pretty familiar with that, like
I love
empire and
that stuff
transition and
too. By the
everything.
by the
Yeah,
way, by the way, look at the name of my company and
yeah.
the logo.
Okay,
So
there you
right
go.
there you
Boom.
go.
Yeah. So
I love classics.
there's a great book I also have been it's called Rubicon. Tom Holland wrote it. It's the transition period. Basically zooms right in on the 150 so years of the transition from Roman Republic to empire. But even then, even when they were a republic, they recognized the drawback of being distributed in their form of governance, right? Like they actually had in times of great need, they would call upon a dictator to assume basically martial law or control of the city. And
Interesting. Yeah.
it's just, it's just tough. The answer is like, it just kind of depends. There are like pros and cons and drawbacks, and you can, anyone can be a sort of history nerd and put their little cap on and look at periods of time where one system has fallen down because of reasons X, Y, and Z, right? Sparta, they competed with Athens and they won, even though they weren't the open and democratic system, right? They're super autocratic, pretty wouldn't be looked on kindly, their system of governance in today's day and age. So it's tough to, I've had a really hard time synthesizing something that feels cohesive about how government should be run. The honest answer is that it's really complicated, I think.
Yes, and to one of the points that you made earlier about how for all the naysayers of the U.S. empire and our imperialistic tendencies, we've been a pretty benevolent empire as empires go,
I
right?
agree.
I mean, even if you take if when you take a look at, like, so for instance, Bretton Woods was our big was our big win after World War II. It wasn't as if we went and plundered the countries of the vanquished, right? We helped rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, and in
Mm-hmm.
so doing, also basically benefited Germany, right? Germany was the vanquished in World War II, but we helped rebuild their economy ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you look at when people naysay the U.S. and laud China's rise and say that China present China somehow as a more uh, uh, benevolent alternative, I just can't see it. I just can't see
I
it.
don't.
I mean, just from a sanctions point alone, I think is interesting, right? From a sanctions point alone, they've already shown. Again, I cite some reference to Agatha Demari's book on backfire, but I think like in 2016, 2017, she cites how China has been essentially studying U.S. sanction legislation and has already been using their own sanctions against South Korea. So don't think for a minute that as much as the U.S. has weaponized the dollar, that China wouldn't do the same or far, far worse if they got people hooked on using the yuan.
I mean, the thing for me about China and the yuan becoming the global reserve currency, I mean, they don't have an open capital account. I just don't.
No,
I don't see how you get past that as a as a whole. I'm
I
in
go
complete
go
agreement with
back
you
to
on that.
my Amazon analogy, my Amazon refund analogy.
Yeah. No, 100%. Michael, maybe we could, I know we got to start to wind down here pretty soon. Can you give us a status? Basically, we haven't even really, we've almost like talked around it this entire podcast, but like, what is the state of the power competition in between China and the US? It looks right now like, I mean, potentially we're fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, but certainly there's an economic power competition that's going on, I think, right out there in the open. But we've had folks like Pippa Malmgren on the show, and she has kind of detailed this idea that we're fighting World War III already. It's just a competition or war that looks very different from how we've thought about it in the past. So can you give us a kind of a state of the union or update on like, what does the power competition look like today? Where do you think we might be headed?
I definitely see there. I mean, there are big threats. I'm not, completely Pollyanna on USA, full blown Peter Zehan style, saying that we can just, we're gonna dominate no matter what because of these innate advantages. I think that there. I think the I think China, unlike the Soviet Union, is a very, very formidable economic power, and we've gotten very, very entangled with them from a global trade perspective. But I see this notion of autarky or self sufficiency starting to take root in reshoring trends. I think that's a healthy thing. Because if there's any I really believe that if there is any country that is capable of true autarky, it's the United States. Because again, you go back to the innate advantages of natural resources and geography, and industrial. And so, by the way, we didn't cover this, but I think it's kind of interesting. Last year, I was invited to participate in this geopolitics panel with the U.S. Army War College, and it's the first time I learned of this acronym called DIME, D-I-M-E, and that's what the U.S. War College teaches as kind of like the four pillars of national power. The D standing for diplomatic means, I being informational, M being military, and E being economic. And the focus of our paper here is to focus on the E of DIME, because I learned, and even by some of the professors that led that section that I participated in at the U.S. Army War College, they basically said that, look, the military does a really good job with the DIM, but where we're somewhat deficient in is the E part. And I think that the core right now of the great power competition between the U.S. and China is on the E part. Hopefully it stays on the E part and it doesn't go kinetic, but that is a danger. That is a danger, right? And Taiwan symbolizes the nexus of the danger, right? Taiwan, I believe, is not only an economic nexus, right? It's a potential kinetic nexus, because Taiwan symbolizes not TSMC, but also it's from a pure geographical perspective. It is the key for for China to be able to force project beyond that first island chain. So to me, if there was a kinetic escalation in the Taiwan Strait, I see that as a far, far bigger deal than Russia-Ukraine. I see it, and I see the ramifications of that potential escalation to have big reverberations on the U.S. dollar. Because if, I don't think we would do this, but if we just basically just laid down and let China take Taiwan, to me, that's actually the biggest threat to the primacy of the U.S. dollar system. It's a geopolitical one.
Yeah,
I think.
I agree with you. Michael, we could keep talking about this for hours, I'm sure, but unfortunately we got to wind down at some point. If folks want to find out more about you, follow you on Twitter. You put out these great threads, but also you appear on a bunch of podcasts. What's the best way people could follow you, just find out more about your work?
Just Twitter right now. It's just at Urban Cowboy with a KAO. And yep, I'm not plugging anything, unlike a lot of I don't write a paid subscription or anything like that. So just Twitter. I mean, lately I've been a little bit less prolific because I've been just really focused on writing this paper, and then hopefully I'll be back to my Twitter ways.
Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being generous with your time and coming on the show. It was a ton of fun.
Yes, it was a great conversation. Great
Yeah,
conversation. Thank you, Michael.
absolutely. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.